Now I want to talk to you about some of the tools that you can use to modify or make sure that your reeds are working well. Last video I talked about the wires, making sure that the wires were tight. Pretty straightforward solution to wires that aren't tight. Just a standard pair of pliers. We can lift the wire up from its closed position, and I can carefully look to see the direction of which the wire has been threaded. So you can see, if you look really close, you can see the wire is moving in a counterclockwise direction. So if I needed to tighten that wire, I would place my pliers on the wire. I can pull towards me with a little bit of pressure and then release the pressure, and I can just gently twist in that same counterclockwise motion. Most reed makers make their twists in this way. It's just how so many of us were instructed. But realistically, every once in a while you will see one that's in the opposite directions. If I wanted to loosen my wire, I would go the opposite. I'd put my pliers on and I'd twist in a clockwise direction. That would take pressure away from the wire and allow for me to loosen the wire if it's too tight. So that wire was actually in pretty good tension. So I'm now just going to fold this back over, use my pliers, and be careful with everything that we do. So that's our wires and our use of the pliers. Next, we can talk about how to make sure that you have the appropriate amount of opening with your aperture of your reed. And the aperture is just that, it's the opening. So you can see here, I'm going to take my pliers and I'm going to put them on the side to side of the first wire. Okay, so that's what it looks like. And if I squeeze gently, I actually increase the opening. I increase the opening. To me, that's a little bit too open. It's going to need a lot of air support to make that work. So I'm going to actually go back and I'm going to close. So here I'm going to do the opposite. So you can see that's closing. So when I use my pliers and apply a little bit of pressure on the first wire, top and bottom, that tip actually closes. So can you do that without pliers? Yes. So with some gentle finger pressure on the side, there we go. You can see that that opens. And then a little bit of finger pressure on the top and bottom, you can see that that closes. But the function of the wires on the bassoon reed have a couple of different roles or jobs. So that tip opening is determined by the amount of tension on this first wire, but we can also do it in the second wire. So, but it's the opposite. If I take my pliers and I put them top and bottom and apply some pressure, it opens. It's the reverse fulcrum. If I take my pliers and put them side to side and I squeeze, it closes. This really affects the overall tone of the reed. I'm going to try and go back to where it was. I like my throat, this is the throat of the reed, to be relatively open. So I typically don't do any changing with my first wire once I've made my reeds. Very, very seldom. I would do most of my work at the second wire, and I will compress this. I've flattened that second wire to make the tip more open, and it gives me more resonance, especially in the low register. There's that good crow. All right, now we can talk about if we need to make any changes to our reed. So earlier I demonstrated using my finger as a support for the reed. The best support for your reed is what we call the plaque, and the plaque can be bought in a number of different places. There are specialty double reed stores. There are different thicknesses and different sizes. There's an oboe plaque as well as a bassoon plaque and as well as a contrabassoon plaque. This one functions as both a contrabassoon plaque and a bassoon plaque. It's large enough, and I can very carefully place it inside the tip. I don't want to go too far, but I want to encourage the opening. So I'm supporting the blades of my reed, and I can press it further in to support further down this blade. Now, one of the things that you can purchase, and this is not especially purchased, is a nail file. So this is just your standard diamond coated nail file that you can pick up at the drugstore. It can be used wet or dry, so I can tip that into the water, and then I can use that to polish little bits of my reed if I need to, or I can go back to my sandpaper. Here's my wet dry 400 sandpaper. Same thing. I can very, very carefully start to do some polishing. And we can talk about some areas of support for your reeds, some things that you want to stay away from, and first steps to make sure that your reed is vibrating the way that it should. All right, so in terms of making sure that your reed is going to work for you, there's a couple of things I want you to look out for. Number one, if you look on the side of your reed, you should see a relatively consistent acceleration or thickening of your reed from the tip down to what we call the back of our reed, and it's gradually getting thicker and thicker and thicker. We don't want it to be really thick, but the problem area in a lot of reeds is this middle spot right here, and this is a great place where you could start to use a little bit of sandpaper if your reed isn't working the way that you want it to. So wet dry sandpaper, just a little bit of thumb pressure. I'm using my finger to support the back of the reed, and I'm going to polish. I'm not getting too far in towards the center. I'm staying out towards the edge, and these 2 or 3 millimeters from the edge. I'm just polishing this, and I'm not taking a lot of material off. I can actually now take my sandpaper, turn it over, and use the paper on the backside to help burnish or polish my reed. So I took a little bit of material off, now I'm polishing. In the same way that we would polish a single reed, I'm now just polishing or burnishing my double reed. So you can see there is a little bit of the material that I took off. It looks like a lot, but it's just the contrast of the dark sandpaper versus the light cane. And I can see a little bit of a ridge right in the center of this reed. We call that the spine. I'm going to smooth that out. Just using my eye, making sure I've got a good light source. You can actually see there's some of that dust that I had sanded away. And I'll take my sandpaper, turn it over, burnish or polish. And it's always about transitions. Wherever I have sanded or wherever I've used a file or wherever I've used a knife, I want to use my sandpaper to help smooth out those transitions from the areas that I worked on to the areas that I haven't. We don't always have to do things the same to both sides, but we want to make sure that it has a similar or symmetrical vibration or feel. So sometimes we need to do something to one side that's not been done to the other just to make it more consistent and more symmetrical. So, good luck. Have fun.